There are moments in life when everything changes in an instant, when the world as you know it shatters into a million pieces, and you're left standing in the wreckage trying to understand how you got there. For Albert Stauch, that moment came when he sat down to watch a grainy surveillance video from his neighbor's security camera. The timestamp read January 27, 2020, 10:13 in the morning. He watched as his red Volkswagen Tiguan backed out of the driveway. He could see two figures in the car, his 11-year-old son Ganon in the passenger seat and his wife Letecia behind the wheel. The video continued. Hours passed. At 2:19 in the afternoon, the red Tiguan returned. The driver's door opened and Letecia stepped out. She walked around to the back of the vehicle, opened the rear hatch, and appeared to be rearranging something inside. Then she closed it and went into the house. Al watched the video again, and again. His hands were shaking. His neighbor Roderick Drayton stood beside him, not knowing what to say, because there was no other figure getting out of that car. Gannon had left that morning with his stepmother, but only Letecia had come home. Al Stauch broke down crying right there in his neighbor's driveway, and through his tears he said the words that would haunt him forever. "She lied to me. She lied." This is the story of Gannon Stauch, an 11-year-old boy who loved video games, making jokes, and spending time with his little sister. A boy his family affectionately called Buddy. A boy whose life was stolen by the person who was supposed to protect him. This is the story of Letecia Stauch, a stepmother who wove an elaborate web of lies so complex, so disturbing, that even seasoned investigators struggled to keep up with her shifting narratives. A woman who would travel over 1,300 miles to dispose of her stepson's body, all while maintaining her innocence and playing the role of concerned parent. This is a story about betrayal, deception, and a community's desperate search for answers. It's a story about a little boy who never made it home. In late January 2020, the Lorson Ranch neighborhood of Colorado Springs seemed like the picture of suburban tranquility. Neat rows of houses with well-maintained lawns, children's bikes left on driveways, basketball hoops standing sentinel in the cold winter air. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other, where kids played together after school, where life felt safe and predictable. The Stauch family lived at 6330 Mandan Drive. Al Stauch was a member of the National Guard, a dedicated father who worked hard to provide for his family. He had two children from his previous marriage to Landon Bullard, 11-year-old Gannon and his younger sister Lena. The kids split time between their parents, but recently they'd been living primarily with their father in Colorado Springs. Al had remarried several years earlier to Letecia Hunt, who brought her own daughter Harley into the blended family. On the surface, it might have looked like a typical American household, navigating the complexities of step-parenting and co-parenting. But beneath that surface, tensions had been building for months. Gannon Stauch was born on September 29, 2008. He was small for his age, with a bright smile and an infectious laugh that could light up a room. His friends knew him as the kid who was always cracking jokes, always ready to play another round of whatever video game was popular at the moment. His teachers described him as a sweet child, sometimes a little shy, but kind-hearted and eager to please. His parents, Al and Landon, adored him. Even though their marriage hadn't worked out, they remained committed to co-parenting their children and making sure Gannon and Lena felt loved and supported. Gannon called his dad's house home, but he visited his mother Landon regularly, and she spoke to the kids often. They had their routines, their inside jokes, their special ways of connecting. Landon would later say that Gannon had the kind of spirit that just made you want to be around him. He was her buddy, her baby boy, her whole heart walking around outside her body. "That's what it feels like to be a mother," she would explain. "Your children carry a piece of your soul with them wherever they go." Letecia Stauch had married Al in 2015, bringing her daughter Harley into the family. By most accounts, the marriage had been rocky from the start. Letecia worked in education, and neighbors would later describe her as someone who seemed nice enough on the surface but always had an edge to her, a certain intensity that made people uncomfortable. She was the type of person who always seemed to be in the middle of some drama, always had a story about how someone had wronged her, always positioned herself as the victim in every scenario. Al's children, Gannon and Lena, had a complicated relationship with their stepmother. There were concerns that Landon had expressed to Al about how Letecia treated the kids when he wasn't around. But Al, like many parents in blended family situations, tried to keep the peace. He worked long hours. He was often away for National Guard duties. He relied on Letecia to care for his children, and he wanted to believe that everything was fine. He wanted to trust his wife. Looking back, that trust would become one of his deepest regrets. The weekend before Gannon disappeared, there were signs that something was wrong. On Sunday, January 26, 2020, Letecia sent text messages to Al telling him that Gannon had an accident. She said they'd had to come back early from an outing because Gannon wasn't feeling well. She mentioned that Gannon had hurt himself somehow, though the details of this supposed injury kept changing. Al was at work, fulfilling his National Guard obligations, and he couldn't be home to check on his son himself. He texted back asking if Gannon was okay if he needed to go to the doctor. Letecia assured him everything was under control, just a minor accident, nothing to worry about. She'd take care of it. She always had everything under control, or so she said. The next day, Monday, January 27, 2020, started like any other weekday morning in the Stauch household. Al had already left for work. Lena, Gannon's younger sister, was home along with Letecia's daughter Harley. Gannon was there too, getting ready for another day. According to Letecia's initial account to law enforcement, Gannon asked if he could go to a friend's house that afternoon. She said yes. She claimed she last saw him between 3:15 and 4 in the afternoon when he left to walk to his friend's house just down the street in their neighborhood. Gannon was wearing a blue jacket, she told police. He took his phone with him. She expected him back before dinner. But when the hours ticked by and Gannon didn't come home, Letecia said she started to worry. She called his phone. No answer. She checked with the friend's house. The friend's parents said Gannon had never shown up. She drove around the neighborhood looking for him, or at least that's what she claimed. Around 6:55 in the evening, with darkness settling over Colorado Springs and the temperature dropping, Letecia finally called the El Paso County Sheriff's Office to report that her stepson was missing. When deputies arrived at the Stauch home that night around 10 in the evening, Letecia played the part of the worried stepmother. She was anxious. She was concerned. She gave them Gannon's description and told them about his blue jacket and his phone. The deputies initially classified Gannon's disappearance as a runaway case, an 11-year-old boy who'd left to go to a friend's house and hadn't come back. It wasn't ideal, but it happened sometimes. Kids got distracted, lost track of time, maybe got scared they'd be in trouble and decided to hide out for a while. The deputies took down all the information, made note of what Letecia was wearing, what her demeanor was like, and told her they'd start looking for Gannon right away. They'd check with friends, search the neighborhood, put the word out. Most of these cases, they reassured her, kids turn up within 24 hours. But something about this case didn't sit right with the responding officers. Maybe it was something in Letecia's voice. Maybe it was the way her story didn't quite line up. Maybe it was just instinct, that gut feeling that law enforcement officers develop after years of looking people in the eye and determining whether they're telling the truth. Whatever it was, the deputies made note of their concerns in their report that night. By Tuesday morning, January 28, 2020, Gannon Stauch had been missing for nearly 24 hours, and panic was starting to set in throughout the community. His face was everywhere. Local news stations ran his photo. Social media exploded with shares and comments and theories. The El Paso County Sheriff's Office organized a massive search effort, calling in additional resources and volunteers. They searched the neighborhood street by street, house by house. They combed through nearby parks and open spaces. They checked storm drains and culverts. They brought in search dogs. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was notified. Gannon's mother, Landon, who lived in South Carolina, got the call that every parent dreads. Your child is missing. She was on the next flight to Colorado, her heart pounding, her mind racing through every terrible possibility. When she arrived, she joined the search efforts, handing out flyers, talking to reporters, begging anyone who might have seen her son to come forward. She looked into the cameras with tears streaming down her face and pleaded for Gannon to come home. For whoever had him to please, please let him go. Al was doing the same, organizing search parties, coordinating with law enforcement, trying desperately to hold himself together even as his world was falling apart. And then there was Letecia. In those early days of the search, she was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. She participated in some search efforts, posting on social media about how worried she was, how much she loved Ganon, how she just wanted him to come home safely. But there was something off about her posts. They were long, rambling, defensive. Instead of focusing solely on finding Ganon, she seemed more concerned with defending herself against unnamed accusers. She wrote about how hard it was to be a stepmother, how people were quick to judge her, how she'd done everything she could to take care of Ganon. It struck many people as odd. Your stepson is missing, possibly in danger, and you're writing paragraphs about how people are being mean to you. Priorities seemed misaligned. Neighbors started talking among themselves, sharing their concerns, their suspicions. Something wasn't right about Letecia's story, and the more she talked, the less sense it made. On February 3, 2020, exactly 1 week after Gannon vanished, Roderick Drayton made a decision that would blow the case wide open. Drayton lived across the street from the Stauch family, and his home security system had cameras that captured views of the neighborhood, including the Stauch driveway. In the days following Gannon's disappearance, as he watched the search efforts intensify and listened to Letecia's various accounts of what happened that Monday, something nagged at him. He decided to review his security footage from January 27, just to see if there was anything that might help the investigation. What he found made his blood run cold. The footage showed Letecia and Gannon leaving the house together in the red Tiguan at 10:13 in the morning. According to Drayton, the video appeared to show Gannon walking slowly as he approached and got into the truck. This directly contradicted Letecia's statement that Gannon had left on foot in the afternoon to walk to a friend's house, but even more damning was what the footage showed hours later. At 2:19 in the afternoon, the Tiguan returned. Letecia got out of the driver's side. She went to the back of the vehicle and appeared to be moving something around in the cargo area. Then she went inside. There was no sign of Gannon. The boy who had left in that car just over 4 hours earlier was nowhere to be seen. Drayton immediately contacted law enforcement and provided them with the footage. Then he did something else. He showed the video to Al Stauch. He felt the father had a right to know what his security camera had captured. When Al watched that footage, when he saw his son get into the car with Letecia and then saw only Letecia return, something inside him shattered. This was the moment when suspicion turned into horrifying certainty. This was the moment when he had to confront the possibility that his wife, the woman he'd married and trusted with his children, might have done something unspeakable to his little boy. Al broke down completely. He told Drayton that Letecia had lied to him, lied to everyone. She'd said Gannon left on foot in the afternoon, but the video proved otherwise. Gannon had left with her in the morning and he'd never come back. From that moment on, the investigation shifted dramatically. Letecia Stauch was no longer just a concerned stepmother helping to search for a missing child. She was the primary suspect in whatever had happened to Gannon. The surveillance footage changed everything. Law enforcement had been suspicious before, but now they had concrete evidence that Letecia had lied about fundamental facts surrounding Gannon's disappearance. If she lied about how and when he left the house, what else was she lying about? Detectives intensified their focus on Letecia, tracking her movements, analyzing her phone records, interviewing everyone who'd had contact with her in the days before and after Gannon went missing. And with each new piece of evidence they uncovered, the picture that emerged was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Letecia Stauch hadn't just lied about what happened to Gannon. She'd been lying about almost everything, spinning an increasingly elaborate web of deception that would ultimately ensnare her completely. On February 5, 2020, investigators descended on the Stauch home with search warrants. They brought their mobile crime lab, their evidence collection teams, their specialists in forensics and blood spatter analysis. They were going to process that house from top to bottom, and what they found would confirm their worst fears. They started in Gannon's bedroom, a space that should have been filled with the ordinary clutter of childhood, video games and sports equipment and school books. Instead, they found a crime scene. There was blood, not just a little blood from a minor injury, but a significant amount. 54 individual blood drops were found on the walls of Gannon's bedroom. The blood spatter patterns told a story of violence, of multiple impacts, of a struggle. The patterns indicated that blood had been cast off from a bloody object being swung, that there had been more than one type of injury inflicted. Crime scene investigators would later testify that the evidence suggested sharp force injuries, blunt force trauma, and gunshot wounds. The blood spatter was on the walls at different heights, with many of the stains located below the level of Gannon's bed, indicating he'd been on the floor at some point during the attack. Even more telling, some of the blood stains appeared diluted, blurred, not well defined. Someone had tried to clean up the evidence. Investigators pulled up the carpet in Gannon's room and found a large pool of blood on the concrete floor beneath, right where his bed had been positioned. They found blood in the hallway leading from his room. They found blood in the garage. They tested the red Tiguan that Letecia had been driving on January 27, and they found blood inside the vehicle as well. The forensic evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. Something violent had happened to Gannon Stauch in his own bedroom, in his own home, in a place where he should have been safe, and all signs pointed to his stepmother being responsible. When confronted with this evidence, Letecia's response wasn't to break down and confess. It wasn't to show remorse or offer any explanation that might make sense of the carnage investigators had found. Instead, she doubled down on her lies and began crafting even more outlandish stories to explain away the evidence. Letecia's stories changed constantly, evolving and shifting like sand dunes in the wind. When pressed about the surveillance video showing her leaving with Gannon and returning alone, she claimed that she had taken Gannon to a friend's house during that time frame. When investigators pointed out that no such friend could corroborate this, she changed her story again. She said Gannon had been with her running errands. When they asked what errands, she couldn't provide specifics. She said they'd gone to Petco to look at fish. She said they'd stopped at various locations around Colorado Springs. Each version contradicted the last, but Letecia seemed unconcerned with consistency. She just kept talking, kept explaining, kept trying to craft a narrative that would deflect suspicion away from herself. She told investigators that on the night of January 27, she'd gone out driving to look for Gannon. She claimed she'd driven to a remote area near Palmer Lake. Why would she go there to look for Gannon when he'd supposedly gone missing from their neighborhood? She didn't have a good answer for that, but investigators found her claim interesting, especially when they went to areas she'd mentioned and found a piece of particle board stained with blood. Gannon's blood. The lies got even more bizarre as February wore on. On February 14, 2020, Letecia presented law enforcement with an entirely new version of events, one so outlandish that investigators could barely believe what they were hearing. She claimed that she had been raped in her own home by a man. She said that this man had abducted Gannon. In this version of the story, Letecia was a victim herself, traumatized and terrified, trying to cope with her own assault while desperately worried about her stepson. The problem was, investigators quickly determined that this story was completely fabricated. The man she named had absolutely no connection to the case. He hadn't been anywhere near the Stauch home on January 27 or any other relevant date. Letecia's claim that she'd been raped was unsupported by any medical evidence, any witnesses, any corroboration whatsoever. It was yet another lie, this time weaponizing SA as a cover story for murder. But Letecia wasn't done. She elaborated on the abduction story, adding more details in an apparent attempt to make it more believable. She told investigators that a man had followed her and Gannon home from Petco that Monday morning. She said he'd forced his way into situations where he could take Gannon. In another version, she said that Gannon had been injured, and that's when an abductor appeared and took the child. None of it made any sense. The stories didn't align with the physical evidence. They didn't align with the timeline. They didn't align with witness statements or surveillance footage or phone records or any other verifiable fact in the case. Letecia was simply making things up as she went along, throwing out one wild story after another in the desperate hope that something would stick, that something would divert attention away from the mounting evidence of her guilt. She also tried to manipulate her neighbors into supporting her false narratives. One neighbor later testified that Letecia had approached her and asked her to lie to law enforcement. Letecia wanted this neighbor to tell police that she'd seen Gannon on January 27, to corroborate the story that he'd been alive and well that afternoon. The neighbor refused and immediately reported the conversation to investigators. It was yet another example of Letecia's calculated attempts to construct a false reality, to enlist others in her deception, to avoid accountability for what she'd done. Her own daughter, Harley Hunt, would later testify about the text messages Letecia sent her in the days and weeks after Gannon's disappearance. Letecia had written things like, "I have to get an attorney fast." She told Harley that she was being set up, that people were trying to blame her for something she didn't do. She instructed Harley not to talk to detectives, not to open the door if law enforcement came to the house. When Harley did ask questions, Letecia would become angry. The level of manipulation and control Letecia exerted over those around her was chilling. While investigators worked to untangle Letecia's web of lies, they were also desperately trying to find Gannon. Where was he? If he'd been killed in his bedroom, as the blood evidence suggested, what had Letecia done with his body? The answer to that question would prove to be as disturbing as everything else about this case. Letecia hadn't just killed her stepson. She transported his remains across multiple state lines in a calculated effort to ensure he would never be found. The journey she took with Gannon's body was over 1,300 miles, a cross-country odyssey of horror that would take her from Colorado to Florida and ultimately lead to her arrest in South Carolina. Investigators began piecing together Letecia's movements in the days following Gannon's disappearance, using cell phone data, credit card records, surveillance footage from gas stations and hotels, and witness statements. What they uncovered was a meticulous timeline of deception and disposal. Based on what investigators were able to piece together, on January 28, the day after Gannon was reported missing, Letecia's phone was placed on airplane mode for several hours that evening, effectively making her location untraceable during that critical window. But data from the Tiguan's internal systems told a different story. The vehicle was tracked to remote areas during that time frame. Most investigators agree that Letecia had attempted to dispose of something, perhaps Gannon's body or evidence related to his murder, but for whatever reason, that disposal wasn't permanent. Maybe she got spooked. Maybe she realized the location wasn't remote enough. Maybe she simply changed her mind about her plan. Whatever the reason, based on what we know, Gannon's body wasn't left in Colorado. Letecia had other plans that would take her much farther from home. In early February, Letecia rented a van. She told people she needed it to help with the search efforts for Gannon, to transport supplies and volunteers. But investigators believed the real reason was far more sinister. She needed a larger vehicle to transport Gannon's remains without detection. On February 1, 2020, Letecia's half-brother, Dakota Lowery, was visiting the Stauch home. He would later provide testimony that would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. Dakota told investigators that he'd seen Letecia loading a large, heavy green suitcase into the rental van. The suitcase was so heavy that Letecia struggled to lift it, and Dakota offered to help. She refused, insisting she could manage it herself. When Dakota asked what was in the suitcase, Letecia told him it was softball equipment. Dakota thought it was strange at the time, and later said he didn't feel right about it, but he didn't press the issue. Looking back, he realized with horror what had likely been inside that suitcase. It was Gannon. Letecia had placed her stepson's body in a suitcase and was preparing to transport him far from Colorado, far from the searches and the investigators and anyone who might discover what she'd done. On or around February 3, 2020, Letecia and her daughter Harley set out on a road trip. Letecia told Harley they were going to visit family, that they needed to get away from all the stress and media attention surrounding Gannon's disappearance. But the trip had a very specific purpose, and it wasn't about visiting relatives. Surveillance footage and digital records tracked their journey from Colorado through multiple states, heading southeast. Letecia was careful, avoiding detection when she could, stopping at various locations, trying to minimize her exposure to cameras and witnesses. But in the modern age, it's nearly impossible to move across the country without leaving some kind of digital footprint. Investigators were able to track her progress, piecing together her route bit by bit. The rental van was captured on gas station security cameras. Credit card transactions pinged at various locations. Cell phone towers registered her phone's movement across state lines. Authorities later asked anyone who had seen Letecia Stauch in Pace or Pensacola, Florida between February 3 and 5 to come forward. The destination was Florida, specifically the area around Pensacola. Based on the evidence and timeline presented at trial, this could imply that around February 4 or 5, 2020, Letecia stopped on a bridge over the Escambia River in Pace, Florida. The bridge is located in a relatively remote area, the kind of place where someone might go unnoticed. It was there, according to later evidence, that Letecia disposed of the suitcase containing Gannon's body. She threw it off the bridge, presumably believing that it would sink, that it would be carried away by the current, that it would never be found. For a while, it seemed like her plan might work. The searches in Colorado continued. Volunteers combed the mountains and forests around Colorado Springs. Dive teams searched local lakes and reservoirs. But Gannon's body was over 1,000 miles away, hidden beneath a Florida bridge in a waterway most investigators would never have thought to check. After disposing of Gannon's remains, Letecia continued her journey. She and Harley eventually made their way to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Letecia had connections there, people she could stay with while she waited to see how the investigation would unfold. She seemed to believe that if Gannon's body was never found, she could continue to maintain her innocence. Without a body, prosecutors would have a harder time building a murder case against her. She could keep spinning her stories, keep playing the victim, keep insisting that some mysterious abductor had taken her stepson and she was just as desperate to find him as everyone else. But Letecia had made a critical miscalculation. Investigators already had overwhelming evidence of her guilt, even without Gannon's body. They had the blood in his bedroom. They had the surveillance footage. They had her constantly changing stories and her attempts to manipulate witnesses. They had phone records and vehicle tracking data that contradicted her claims. They had enough to charge her with murder. On March 2, 2020, law enforcement arrested Letecia Stauch at a residence in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. She was charged with first-degree murder in connection with Gannon's death, as well as child abuse resulting in death, tampering with a deceased human body, and tampering with physical evidence. The arrest made national headlines. The case had captured public attention from the beginning, but the arrest of a stepmother for the murder of her 11-year-old stepson brought renewed media focus. Letecia was extradited back to Colorado to face the charges. In court appearances, she appeared calm, almost detached, as if the proceedings were happening to someone else. She maintained her innocence, insisting that the charges against her were based on lies and misunderstandings. Her attorneys indicated they would be pursuing a not guilty by reason of insanity defense. Al Stauch gave a statement to the press after her arrest, his voice shaking with emotion. He said that his heart had stopped twice in the past month, once when he watched the surveillance video showing Gannon leaving with Letecia, and not returning. And again, when he got the call that his wife had been arrested for killing his son. He talked about the guilt he felt for trusting Letecia with his children, for not seeing the warning signs, for not protecting Ganon when he needed protection most. But even with Letecia in custody, one agonizing question remained. Where was Ganon? His body still hadn't been found, and his family desperately needed to bring him home. They needed to lay him to rest with dignity and love. They needed closure, as much as anyone can find closure after such a devastating loss. Investigators knew from Letecia's travel patterns and other evidence that she'd been in Florida in early February. They knew about the suitcase that Dakota Lowery had seen. They suspected that Ganon's body had been disposed of somewhere along Letecia's route, most likely in Florida. But Florida is a big state with countless waterways, forests, and remote areas where remains could be hidden. Finding Ganon would require patience, persistence, and more than a little luck. That break came on March 17, 2020, just over 2 weeks after Letecia's arrest. A worker with the Florida Department of Transportation, doing routine work on the Escambia River Bridge near Pace, Florida, noticed something unusual. There was a large suitcase under the bridge. The worker reported the finding to local authorities, who immediately contacted the FBI and the El Paso County Sheriff's Office. Could this be Ganon? When investigators recovered the suitcase and carefully opened it, they found human remains inside. The body was wrapped in blankets, folded into a confined space, treated like garbage to be discarded and forgotten. Dental records and DNA analysis confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. It was Gannon Stauch. The little boy who'd been missing for 50 days had finally been found. He was so far from home, so far from the people who loved him, hidden away in a place where Letecia had hoped no one would ever look. The news that Ganon's remains had been found was bittersweet for his family. On one hand, they could finally bring him home. On the other hand, the confirmation that he was truly gone, that there would be no miracle rescue, was devastating. Landon Bullard and Al Stauch traveled to Florida to be present as their son was recovered. They held each other and wept. They made arrangements to bring Ganon back to Colorado. They began planning a funeral for a child who should have been playing video games and going to school and growing up to chase his dreams. The autopsy results were heartbreaking in their brutality. Dr. Susan Ignacio, who helped perform the autopsy, testified that Ganon had suffered 18 sharp force injuries from a knife or blade. He had 4 blunt force injuries to his head, including skull fractures and a hole in his jaw. And he had 1 gunshot wound to his jaw area. The medical examiner determined that the manner of death was homicide. Ganon's entire body was decomposed when found, with some bones showing, and he was still wearing the clothes he died in. The violence inflicted on this small child was almost incomprehensible. What could drive someone to do such a thing? What kind of rage or hatred or dysfunction could lead a person to murder an 11-year-old boy in such a brutal fashion? These were the questions that would haunt everyone who followed this case, and they were questions that would take center stage when Letecia Stauch finally went to trial. The legal proceedings in the case of Colorado versus Letecia Stauch would take years to unfold. Following the discovery of Ganon's body, the El Paso County District Attorney's Office filed additional charges against Letecia, including first-degree murder after deliberation and 8 counts of crime of violence, which are enhanced charges used to increase punishment for alleged use of a firearm, a blunt instrument, a knife, or other sharp object. The prosecution's theory was clear. Letecia Stauch had murdered her stepson Ganon in his bedroom on January 27, 2020. She had stabbed him, beaten him, and shot him in a prolonged and brutal attack. She had then attempted to clean up the crime scene, though the blood evidence she left behind was still overwhelming. She had transported Ganon's body, ultimately driving it over 1,300 miles to Florida, where she threw it off a bridge. Throughout this entire ordeal, she had lied repeatedly to law enforcement, to her family, and to the public. She had spun elaborate stories to deflect blame. She had tried to manipulate witnesses. She had shown no genuine remorse for what she'd done. And all of this, the prosecution argued, proved that Letecia Stauch knew exactly what she was doing. She knew right from wrong. She was capable of understanding the consequences of her actions. She was not insane. She was a cold-blooded killer. The defense team, however, had a different narrative to present. They acknowledged that Letecia had killed Ganon, that much was undeniable given the overwhelming physical evidence. But they argued that she was not guilty by reason of insanity. Their strategy centered on convincing the jury that at the time of the murder, Letecia was experiencing a psychotic break, that she was suffering from severe mental illness that prevented her from understanding the nature and wrongfulness of her actions. To support this claim, they brought in expert witnesses, most notably Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a psychiatrist who had made a career out of evaluating defendants in high-profile murder cases. Dr. Lewis testified that in her professional opinion, Letecia Stauch had dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. She claimed that Letecia had experienced severe childhood trauma that had fractured her psyche into multiple distinct personalities. According to this theory, one of these alternate personalities, which Dr. Lewis said she had met and referred to as Maria, had committed the murder, not the Letecia that people knew in everyday life. The defense argued that during the attack on Ganon, Letecia was in a dissociative state, that she was not in control of her actions, that she couldn't have formed the intent necessary for first-degree murder. The prosecution countered this insanity defense with their own experts and with evidence of Letecia's behavior before, during, and after the murder. They pointed out that Letecia had shown clear signs of planning and deliberation. She had carefully constructed alibis. She had attempted to clean up evidence. She had disposed of the body in a calculated manner, traveling across multiple states to do so. These were not the actions of someone who was psychotic or dissociative. These were the actions of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was trying desperately not to get caught. The prosecution also highlighted body camera footage from interactions with law enforcement and presented evidence of Letecia's online searches in the days following the murder. They showed that Letecia had been active on social media, carefully crafting her public image and responding to perceived critics. None of this behavior was consistent with someone in the grip of a psychotic episode. State hospital evaluators who had examined Letecia came to a very different conclusion than Dr. Lewis. They found that while Letecia had personality disorders and other mental health issues, she did not meet the criteria for legal insanity. She understood right from wrong. She was able to conform her behavior to the law. She simply chose not to. The state's experts testified that Letecia had exaggerated her mental health symptoms during evaluations, that she had tried to fake or embellish her supposed dissociative episodes. They noted that her symptoms seemed to appear and disappear conveniently depending on the situation. When it benefited her to appear mentally ill, she played up her symptoms. When it benefited her to appear rational and competent, she was perfectly capable of doing so. The jury would have to weigh all of this evidence and decide. Was Letecia Stauch a woman so severely mentally ill that she couldn't be held criminally responsible for her actions? Or was she a manipulative killer who murdered her stepson and then tried to use mental illness as an excuse? The trial of Letecia Stauch began in April 2023, more than 3 years after Ganon's death. The proceedings took place in El Paso County, Colorado, and they lasted for 5 weeks. The courtroom was packed with media, with members of the community who had followed the case from the beginning, and most importantly, with Ganon's family. Landon Bullard was there, sitting through the horrific testimony about what had been done to her son. Al Stauch was there, forced to confront the reality that the woman he'd married and trusted had destroyed his family. Ganon's younger sister Lena was there as well. They listened as witness after witness took the stand. They heard from the neighbor Roderick Drayton, who had captured the surveillance footage. They heard from investigators who described the blood evidence in Ganon's bedroom. They heard from forensic experts who detailed the injuries Ganon had suffered. They heard from Letecia's own daughter Harley Hunt, who testified about her mother asking her to buy cleaning supplies the night of Gannon's disappearance, and about text messages Letecia sent her. They heard from Letecia's half-brother Dakota Lowry, who became emotional on the stand, asking why Tecia before testifying about the heavy green suitcase he'd helped move. They heard recordings of Letecia's phone calls and interviews with police, recordings where her stories constantly shifted and changed. The prosecution presented a timeline that was both comprehensive and damning. On the morning of January 27, 2020, while Al was at work, Letecia had attacked Gannon in his bedroom. The assault was prolonged and brutal, involving stabbing, beating, and ultimately a gunshot. After killing him, Letecia had attempted to clean up the blood, but the sheer volume of it made complete cleanup impossible. She placed Gannon's body in the suitcase. Over the next several days, as the search intensified and investigators began to focus on her, Letecia transported Gannon's body across the country to Florida. Throughout this entire period, she maintained constant communication with investigators and with her family, lying at every turn, spinning new stories whenever the old ones fell apart. The prosecution argued that the motive for the murder was rooted in Letecia's hatred for Gannon and her desire to hurt Al Stauch. Evidence presented at trial suggested that the marriage between Al and Letecia had been deteriorating. Letecia resented the attention Al gave to his children from his first marriage. There were indications that Letecia blamed Gannon for various issues. She saw him not as a child who deserved love and protection, but as a problem. On that January morning, something had triggered her rage, and she had acted on her violent impulses, and an innocent child had paid the ultimate price. The defense put on their case, calling Dr. Lewis and other witnesses to testify about Letecia's alleged mental illness. Dr. Lewis spent hours on the stand describing her theory of dissociative identity disorder, explaining how childhood trauma could create alternate personalities, arguing that Letecia was not responsible for her actions because a different aspect of her fractured psyche had committed the murder. The defense also pointed to Letecia's behavior in court, where she often appeared to display distress. They argued that this demonstrated her fragile mental state, but the prosecution's cross-examination of Dr. Lewis was withering. They challenged her methodology, her conclusions, her willingness to take Letecia's self-reported symptoms at face value. They presented evidence that contradicted her diagnoses. They highlighted the fact that other mental health professionals who had evaluated Letecia had come to very different conclusions. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that the jury was not buying the insanity defense. The evidence of Letecia's planning, her deception, her calculated attempts to avoid detection, all pointed to someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The prosecution's closing arguments hammered this point home. They reminded the jury of all the lies Letecia had told, all the ways she tried to manipulate the investigation, all the evidence of her consciousness of guilt. They asked the jury to think about Ganon, a little boy who should have been safe in his own home, who should have been able to trust the adults in his life. They asked the jury to hold Letecia accountable for what she'd done. The defense's closing arguments focused on mental illness, on the idea that Letecia was sick and needed treatment, not punishment. They asked the jury to have compassion, to understand that mental illness can drive people to do terrible things they wouldn't otherwise do. On May 8, 2023, a Monday, after deliberating for nearly 8 hours over the course of Friday and Monday, the jury returned their verdict. They found Letecia Stauch guilty on all counts. Guilty of first-degree murder after deliberation. Guilty of first-degree murder of a child under 12 by a person in a position of trust. Guilty of child abuse resulting in death. Guilty of tampering with a deceased human body. Guilty of tampering with physical evidence. The courtroom erupted in tears and emotion. Landon Bullard sobbed. Al Stauch closed his eyes and bowed his head. After more than 3 years of waiting, after enduring unspeakable grief and trauma, Gannon's family finally had justice. The jury had seen through Letecia's lies and manipulation. They had recognized her for what she was, not a victim of mental illness, but a cold-blooded killer who had murdered an innocent child. The sentencing phase followed shortly after the verdict, approximately 30 minutes after the verdicts were read. Judge Gregory Werner presided over the proceedings, listening to victim impact statements from Gannon's family and considering the appropriate punishment for Letecia's crimes. Landon Bullard gave a powerful statement, speaking directly about her son and the impact his loss had on her life and the lives of everyone who loved him. She talked about Gannon's smile, his laugh, his kind heart. She talked about all the milestones he would never reach, all the experiences he would never have. She talked about the pain of knowing that her son had suffered, that he had been betrayed by someone who should have protected him. But she also made it clear that Letecia would not have the final word on Gannon's legacy. Gannon's life had meaning. He had touched people. He had brought joy and love into the world. And even in death, he had brought people together, had strengthened faith and community, had reminded everyone of the preciousness of life and the importance of protecting children. Al Stauch also addressed the court, speaking about the guilt he carried for not protecting his son, for trusting Letecia, for not seeing the signs of danger. He talked about how his life had been destroyed, how he would never be the same. But he also expressed his commitment to honoring Gannon's memory, to making sure his son would never be forgotten. Other family members and friends spoke as well, painting a picture of a vibrant, loving child who had been stolen from them far too soon. Judge Werner then addressed Letecia Stauch directly before sentencing. He admonished her for claiming mental illness as the reason for her actions, saying that it did a disservice to those who actually suffer from mental illness. He stated, "The facts in this case are the most horrific I have ever seen. Your conduct in this case deserves the maximum sentence that I can impose according to Colorado law." He noted that Letecia had shown no remorse throughout the process, and instead had made a choice to build a web of lies. Judge Werner sentenced Letecia Stauch to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the 2 murder charges. He sentenced her to an additional 12 years with 3-year parole for tampering with a deceased human body, consecutive to the life sentence, and 18 months consecutive to life for tampering with physical evidence. The 2 life sentences would merge into 1 life sentence without the possibility of parole. The sentences ensured that Letecia would spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. During the sentencing hearing, defendants are typically given the opportunity to address the court regarding their sentencing. Letecia Stauch chose to decline to speak. She had been convicted, and she apparently could not or would not address the consequences of her actions or the pain of Gannon's family. Her silence spoke volumes. Even at the end, she was focused on herself, on avoiding accountability, on maintaining control in whatever small way she could. She is currently incarcerated in Colorado, serving her life sentence. She will never be free again. She will never have the opportunity to hurt another child. And while her imprisonment cannot bring Gannon back, it ensures that she cannot cause any more harm. For Gannon's family, the verdict and sentence provided some measure of justice, but the pain of his loss will never fully heal. Landon and Al have both spoken publicly about their ongoing grief, about the challenge of moving forward when part of your heart is missing. Lena, Gannon's little sister, is growing up without her beloved brother, carrying the trauma of his loss with her as she navigates life. The Letecia Stauch case raises so many questions that still don't have satisfactory answers. How could a stepmother, someone who was supposed to care for and protect a child, commit such unspeakable violence against him? What was going through Letecia's mind during those horrific moments in Gannon's bedroom? Was it rage? Was it hatred? Was it some twisted desire to hurt Al by destroying what he loved most? We may never fully understand her motivations. Even with all the evidence, all the testimony, all the psychological evaluations, the why of this case remains elusive. Letecia has never shown genuine remorse. She has never fully explained her actions. She has never apologized to Gannon's family. She continues to maintain that she is a victim, that she was unfairly targeted, that mental illness should excuse what she did. But the jury saw through that narrative, and so does anyone who looks objectively at the facts of this case. What we do know is that on January 27, 2020, an 11-year-old boy named Gannon Stauch was attacked in his bedroom and killed. The person who should have been protecting him instead attacked him with unimaginable brutality. The person who should have been calling 911 and trying to save his life instead tried to cover up what she'd done. The person who should have been helping search for him instead drove his body 1,300 miles away and threw him off a bridge like he was nothing, like he didn't matter. But Gannon did matter. He mattered to his mother, to his father, to his sister, to his extended family and friends. He mattered to the community that searched for him tirelessly. He mattered to the investigators who worked around the clock to find him and bring his killer to justice. And he matters to all of us who followed his story, who grieved for a child we never met, who demanded accountability for his death. The Letecia Stauch case is a reminder that sometimes the danger doesn't come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from inside the home, from the people who are supposed to love and protect us. It's a reminder that we need to listen when children express fear or discomfort around adults in their lives. It's a reminder that abuse often escalates, that warning signs are often visible if we're paying attention. And it's a reminder that justice, while it can never undo the harm that's been done, is still worth fighting for. Gannon's family fought for 3 years to see Letecia held accountable. They endured a trial that forced them to relive the worst moments of their lives. They sat in a courtroom and listened to the details of how Gannon suffered. They did all of this because Gannon deserved justice. He deserved to have his story told, his life honored, his death avenged within the bounds of the law. Today, Gannon Stauch is remembered not primarily as a victim, though he certainly was one, but as a beloved son, brother, and friend. His family has worked to keep his memory alive, to focus on the joy he brought to their lives rather than only on the tragedy of his death. They've established memorials in his name. They've shared stories and photos that capture who Gannon was, his sense of humor, his interests, his personality. They've made sure that anyone who hears about this case knows that Gannon was a real person, not just a headline or a statistic. He was a kid who liked video games and jokes. He was a big brother who loved his little sister. He was a son who deserved to grow up, to go to high school, to fall in love, to chase his dreams, to live a full and happy life. All of that was taken from him by someone he should have been able to trust. Letecia Stauch's name will be remembered too, but for very different reasons. She will be remembered as an example of betrayal, of evil hiding behind a facade of normalcy. Her case will be studied by criminologists and psychologists trying to understand what drives people to commit acts of violence against children. Her lies and manipulations will be dissected in law enforcement training seminars as examples of how suspects attempt to deceive investigators. Her conviction will stand as a testament to the power of forensic evidence and thorough police work, and her life sentence will serve as a warning. You cannot get away with murdering a child. You cannot lie and manipulate your way out of accountability. Justice may take time, but it will come. As we close this chapter on the Letecia Stauch case, we're left with the bittersweet reality that justice was served, but at a cost that can never be repaid. Gannon is gone. His family's lives are forever altered. The community that rallied around the search for him has been scarred by the knowledge of what happened. But there is also hope in the resilience of those who loved Gannon, in their determination to honor his memory, in their refusal to let Letecia's actions define the entirety of his story. Gannon Stauch lived, he laughed, he loved, he mattered, and no one, not even the person who took his life, can ever take that away from him. If you or someone you know is in a situation where a child may be at risk, please reach out for help. Contact local law enforcement, child protective services, or organizations dedicated to protecting children. Trust your instincts. Speak up. It could save a life. Thank you for listening to Gannon's story, for bearing witness to his life and the injustice of his death. May he rest in peace, and may his memory continue to inspire us to protect the most vulnerable among us.